What I want to say first is that this is really early stage and very much out of my comfort zone. So we'll see what you think. I'm going to start with uh, we've done a lot of learning today. This is a very short introduction to Japanese writing. This is modern contemporary Japanese. We've got a handful of different scripts. We've got two, I'm going to call them syllabaries, hiragana, katakana. There are Chinese characters and there's a Latin alphabet. And broadly, you can pretty much write anything using whichever script, and it's mostly codified, but it's also sociolinguistic. Hiragana, katakana, they're both kana, so they operate in a very similar way, but the allograph problem I'm talking about today is a hiragana problem. So we can ignore all the rest of them, and you will hear me using the word kana and hiragana interchangeably. So this is what hiragana looks like today, and that's really modern. So in Japanese, we're reading vertically and right to left. And yeah, so this is called a 50 sound chart because of the way the chart is structured with 5 vowels and 10 columns. There's actually 46 graphemes in the modern chart. 3 of those blanks belong to archaic phonemes with archaic kana, which don't generally appear on the modern chart. Also, this one, I can't type it, so that's a JPEG. But before 1900, there were a lot more hiragana. And this is a really unfriendly chart, but there aren't charts of the allographs. So this is a paleography chart. And this is where we get to the allographs. So if we take this section, this is the phoneme ha, and circled in blue, we've got the modern typographic ha. And in the yellow box, these are 4 handwritten iterations, and the one in the yellow circle is the one that's most similar to modern typographic ha. And in the purple hexagon, that's a Chinese character, which is the parent character of all kana, or hiragana. So hiragana basically originated as highly cursive versions of a parent Chinese character. And here it's nami, which means wave. And then in green, these are all the other alternative ways of writing the same phoneme. So these are all ha, and each one is a cursive representation of the parent Chinese character. And on this chart, we've got 8 ways of writing ha, but this is an abridged chart. So this chart in total has got 240, which I literally had to sit down and manually count them because we don't really talk about. So how did we get from this massive inventory to less than 50? The short version is there was an elementary school ordinance in 1900 from the Ministry of Education, and where there had been many kana with the same pronunciation, these were now restricted to a single form. And from this point onwards, only a single kana was taught for each phoneme, and the other forms became known as variant kana, and those are essentially abolished. So they're not part of the education system anymore, and they're not suitable for writing for public consumption. And I think we can instinctively recognize what's going on here because from our point of view, there's a lot of redundancy. But I want to take you into the historical context so that we can think differently about what's going on. So here we are in the Edo period, Japan's early modern, and that goes from the 17th century to the later 19th century. And I'm using the Great Wave because it's incredibly famous, but also it seems like a deeply traditional Japanese image, but it actually points towards the West. So this intense blue, that is Prussian blue, which is a chemical pigment which had arrived in Japan like a couple of years before Hokusai did this. And the other thing I want to say is that mostly we instinctively read in the same reading order as text. So we will tend to read this left to right, but actually we need to move right to left in the same way as Japanese does. And that's the direction the boats are traveling in. And in this reading, we can read the Great Wave as an enormous threat in the future position. And so we can read this print as revealing a growing Japanese anxiety about the West. And Japan was actually about to be engulfed by something that came over the sea. And this is 1853, 2 decades after the Hokusai's Great Wave. 4 black ships arrived from America with steam power and cannons, demanding trade. And we all know how that goes. Within 15 years, the old order had completely collapsed and the modern era began. So the Meiji period is the beginning of Japan's modern period. And this is a period of urgent change. So in this print, we've got a paddle steamer here. We've got Western style buildings all across here. We've got penny farthing is my favorite. We've got people in Chinese dress, Japanese dress, Western dress. So you've got this whole, it's all very exciting, but the print has this celebratory tone, which belies the upheaval and disruption that Japan's experiencing. And so this is Fukuzawa Yukichi, and he's an intellectual, and his ideas have really helped shape what Japan is like now, modern Japan. He was instrumental in introducing Western ideas to Japan, and he was advocating for rapid modernization, by which we really mean Westernization, to prevent Japan from being colonized. So when he says, when the wind of Western civilization blows to the east, every blade of grass and every tree in the east follow what the Western wind brings. Japan was experiencing an existential threat, and it had a front row seat to the century of humiliation that China's experiencing just over the sea. So they're like, this is a survival issue. So the whole Meiji period was a period of wholesale adoption of these very, very different, radically different ideas coming from the West. And we see profound changes in Japanese society, in almost every domain of life, including language and writings. So the feeling was that the Japanese writing system was holding Japan back from its desired position as a nation state and a strong modern international power. And all of these men were trying to answer the same question, which is how to be more like the Western powers through writing. And they actually date from slightly before the Meiji period. This is in the post-war, and everyone's got a different solution. But the pre-modern writing system was so much at variance with writing systems of colonial powers that it became a problem called the national script problem. And reform was seen as urgently necessary. Allographs are not part of the discourses around the national script problem, but I think the narratives that we see here inform my question about what happened to the allographs. The main problem everyone seems to agree is kanji, Chinese characters, but everybody's got a different solution. Some people want hiragana only, some people want katakana only, romaji only, some people want to keep some limited kanji, and some people literally want to switch to a different language. And in the present day, it's not a settled problem exactly, because there are still campaigns for more Chinese characters. The Association for Kana Writing last updated their website 3 months ago, and there was a book published in 2011 which was advocating for a complete switch to Romaji, the Latin alphabet, with the title "Kanji is the Ruin of Japanese." So, writing system change can be very contentious and emotional, but getting rid of the allographs was not apparently contentious and emotional. So it seems like the ordinance is formalizing something that's already been happening, and that's something only going to come to it. But the question is how to be more like the Western powers through writing. So when people are talking about writing system reform, there are certain themes that come through, like rationality and efficiency, but we can understand their concerns as particularly focused on developing an education system for mass literacy. And viewed through this lens, allographs are a problem because the redundancy of an allographic system is an impediment to mass education. But as an early modernist, this isn't really my business, but as an early modernist, I've always found this strange because I'm already seeing literate masses. So the problem wasn't actually literacy in the abstract. The problem was that Japan had multiple literacies and multiple languages in terms of dialects, sociolects. So there are different forms of expression for different contexts, and no one single writing system or language that was shared between everybody. So what was lacking wasn't mass literacy, but unitary literacy, the unitary literacy of the national subject, which is what was being modelled by the Western colonial powers. So what the wind of Western civilization brought to Japan was the unitary literacy of the national subject, ideas around rationalization and efficiency in writing systems, and phoneticism, which I'm giving it like this big title, but this big word. It operates in lots of different dimensions. So we have the privileging of the transparently phonetic, so like the kana or romaji over problematic things like Chinese characters. And you have several modes of writing, none of which mapped to daily speech. Okay, so the allograph problem that I want to put to you is that the allographs offer a very different kind of visual engagement with writing. And I think this is a kind of engagement with which we are profoundly unfamiliar. And I can't produce a list of all the ways in which allographs work. I can describe some of them, but I haven't been able to find any real research on this. And allographs are involved in orthography, calligraphic choices, so they're complex. But today, we're talking about the visual engagement of Japanese allographic writing using this text. So this is the calligraphy of 17th century courtesan called Nagama. That's her name, bottom right. And this is in a hand scroll in an archive in Japan. And courtesans in the 17th century were like the pinnacle of literary and artistic accomplishment, and calligraphy was absolutely central to their profession. And the hand scroll is the most elevated container for writing, which positioned considerably more highly than books. So what this all tells us is that this is a really highly prized object inscribed by one of the most accomplished practitioners of calligraphy of that period. So I'm going to use this to just give us a sense of what allographic writing might do. But in order to engage with this text, I'm going to tell you what you need to know. Today, any sense of the parent character has disappeared. The link has been broken, and most modern Japanese people are surprised to learn that there is such a thing as a parent character. So now, hiragana are the shape they are because that's the shape they are. But when you look at these 4 iterations of ha, the parent character nami is very present in the top one and sort of decreasingly present as you go down. But irrespective of the degree of cursivity, that parent character informs the shape of the kana version. So the meaning, the parent character is present. So the 2 points I want to make here are, before 1900, the parent character is always hovering behind the shape of the kana, which means that the parent character's meaning is also latently hovering behind the kana. And secondly, we've got a really indistinct boundary between kana and kanji. So going back to the yellow box, the one at the top could be read as the phoneme ha, or as the Chinese character nami, which can also be pronounced ha. So when we see that form, its vocalization, its function, and its meaning are all highly contextual. So let's try reading what Nagaman has written. These 3 lines at the top are the opening of a 10th century poem, but instead of completing the poem, she runs on into prose. So I've divided my translation into 2 sections to reflect. So, oh, for Mount Shinobu's secret paths, that we could know each other's hearts. Alas, my only wish is to know your unconcealed heart. So she's a courtesan, and her profession is love. And this is a kind of love letter. And the text is inviting us to imagine ourselves into her presence, into her confidence, and experience her private desire to know her lover without barriers, even if it's in secret, to circumvent the eyes of the world. Also a big fan of red circles. In the red circle, we're looking at the phrase Shinobuyama Shinobide. So Mount Shinobu is a place that occurs in poetry a lot because the name sounds like the word Shinobu, and the word Shinobu can mean secretly or it can mean yearning, depending on which Chinese character you use. But if you use kana, both meanings are there at once, right? And this is why I suggest the convention in Japanese poetry is to use kana so that there's these multiple layers of meaning happening. So the 10th century poet plays with these multiple meanings of shinobu in this phrase, shinobuyama shinobide. Nagaman takes the text as it's been passed down since the 10th century. So when I say text, for me personally, I discriminate between text and writing. Text is the abstracted or extracted part of it. So she's taken the 10th century text, but not in any particular written form. So any individual inscription is a unique performance of that poem. So for Nagaman, she inscribes it in this way out of her own choices. And so what we see is shinobu, shinobu. We have shi, the phoneme shi twice in those red circles. And she uses 2 different allographs, right? So where in speech we hear shinobu as repetition, in Nagaman's inscription here, that repetition isn't quite as emphatic, it's much more subtle. She's de-emphasized it allographically. And if we now look at her allographs, the second she is not very interesting. The first she has a parent character, kokorozashi, which means desire. So verbally, linguistically, we have yearning and secrecy, and visually, we have this idea of desire, which is really foregrounded. It's really big and juicy and right at the front of the text. So we have this intensity of desire that doesn't appear in the text linguistically. Now, later in the prose section, over here, and the prose section is her own composition, it's not taken from anybody else. We have she twice again, represented in the same way. So linguistically, we have the word to know, which is shiru, which is written with kokorozashi, desire. And linguistically, we have mahoshi, which means desire, but she's used this vertical one. That she is conjugation for desire. So it's an affix for conjugation. So it's not a verbal emphasis that she's giving us here, but a calligraphic, a visual repetition where there isn't a verbal one. So we've got desire in language in Malshta and desire in allograph in shiru. So this prominence of kokorozashi inescapably colours the reading of the text so that the whole page gives this sense of really intense desire. And we have one Chinese character and one kana. The top one is the character kokoro, which means heart, and mo is and. And I absolutely love the way she writes kokoro. It's unique, but textually, the phrase kokoro mo is repeated. And I've bolded it in that transcription, but this section is her own words and it's prose, and it's not poetically meter. So when you read it, it's not a very prominent repetition. But in her calligraphy, we have an emphasis on that repetition with a pair of hearts raised to the top of the line. And the first one is really rich, lush. And then if we look at the way mo is inscribed, and strictly this isn't allographic, but more common allographic. These are the same allograph, but they're inscribed very, very differently. So visually, we have a strong repetition of kokoro and a weak repetition of mo. And for me, the effect is kind of like a visual heartbeat. There's this deliberate repetition. So this is what I've been calling this deep reading, because it's luxurious and it's slow and it's rich and it's lingering. And deep reading, I've based it on the close reading that we do in literary stuff, and slow looking, that's the art historical approach. And I feel that modern reading practices, we reduce visual engagement with writing to merely seeking textual content, whereas deep reading engages with all the modalities of writing. So while I have described this as luxurious and rich and lingering, if this is so great, why do the allographs disappear? And so I'm coming back to the Great Wave, because I use this image to point to the fact that there were changes in Japanese society that are already happening before the Meiji period. And let's remember that this isn't a painting, this is a print. And this was really widely and inexpensively available, like the equivalent of 2 bowls of noodles. Because the beginning of the Edo period, the early modern period, saw the explosion of the publishing industry, which catered for increasingly wider audiences. And for the mass audiences targeted by print, increasingly targeted by print over the period, the phonemic function of kana was most likely the primary and possibly even the only function. Whereas for allographs, they're a resource for a rich and deep kind of visual engagement with writing. So it seems that allographs were part of the deep reading practices of a highly literate elite who became minoritized as literacy spread outward. And in elite circles, manuscript is privileged above print, and texts circulate through manuscript copying. So print reflects a more bourgeois approach to literacy, with writing as a means to an end. And the prevalence of print, I would suggest, obscures more elite practices of deep reading in favor of efficient reading. So getting rid of the allographs was not contentious or emotional by the time we get to the Meiji period, because they were already used in a minimal function kind of way by many people. And they were certainly not about to suddenly become useful in the pursuit of a unitary literacy of an emerging national subject. So what I've called deep reading is recoverable. It is recoverable, but not easily. The allographs point to a visual engagement with writing that is far richer than modern literacy allows for. We don't record the allographs used in any of the texts that we transcribe. So we can't do any corpus level analysis. We don't really understand how they work, all of the things we do. And if we decided to ask a bunch of questions, we don't have any text to ask questions of, because we're not recording them. But I would say that what you're looking at on the screen is a writing system where efficiency is not intrinsically valuable. Allographs offer a richness that shows clearly that efficiency is only a virtue in a certain kind of economy of writing. And I kind of want to say that efficiency, the idea of efficiency, completely misses the point of text like this. So, yeah, the wind of Western civilization, I'm arguing, still blows to the east and in every other direction. And I think that that's an issue which a lot of us are trying to grapple with at the moment. So, thank you.